pivotal week for the Russia-Ukraine conflict. US and Russian officials meet in Saudi Arabia to discuss potential peace talks, with President Vladimir Zelensky visiting Turkey to explore diplomatic avenues. European leaders convened an emergency summit expressing concern over the exclusion of Ukraine from these negotiations. Meanwhile, Ukrainian forces have intensified their counter-offensive, reclaiming territory in the east and deploying advanced drones to disrupt Russian operations. As the war nears its third year, the international community watches closely, hoping for a resolution that ensures lasting peace and stability in the region. Welcome to Think Tank. The Trump administration has initiated talks with Russia over the Ukrainian conflict, marking a significant shift in America's handling of Europe's most destructive conflict in decades. Washington Post reported that the Secretary of State Marco Rubio's discussions with Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov in Saudi Arabia have deeply unsettled Ukraine, raising concerns that US officials may embrace a deal that emboldens President Vladimir Putin. European nations are now discussing sending troops to Ukraine if a deal is reached, but no commitments have been made. According to the New York Times, senior American and Russian officials are meeting in Saudi Arabia for the most extensive negotiations in at least 3 years, as President Trump pushes to end the war in Ukraine and the Kremlin seeks warmer ties with Washington. Russian officials have said they will pursue normalization with the United States, even holding out the possibility that major American oil companies could return to Russia. The meeting comes less than a week after Trump's lengthy phone call with President Vladimir Putin of Russia. The goal of the talks is to start a real normalization of the relationship between the two countries, and Russia and Washington focusing on the business ties and the Trump administration's interests in profit and natural resources. However, the news of the planned talks has been met with confusion and concern in Europe and Ukraine. Ukrainian officials insist they cannot recognize any agreements made about their country without their involvement. In a major diplomatic shift, peace talks between US and Russian officials to resolve the Russo-Ukraine conflict have commenced in Saudi Arabia, raising hopes for an end to the 3-year conflict.
Good morning, Foreign Minister.
In a pivotal development, peace talks between US and Russian officials to resolve the Russia-Ukraine war have begun in Saudi Arabia. This marks a significant shift in diplomatic dynamics, with key geopolitical figures actively seeking an end to the devastating 3-year conflict. Notably, President Vladimir Zelensky would not participate in the Saudi discussions, signaling a complex path toward reconciliation. Meanwhile, European leaders held an emergency summit as concerns grow over the US mediation efforts under President Donald Trump. The Trump administration's direct involvement in these talks comes at a time of high tensions between the West and Moscow. Trump's approach of engaging with Russia, historically controversial, is now viewed by some as a necessary step to facilitate dialogue. His stance presents a potential avenue for ending the war, though it leaves Kyiv and European allies feeling increasingly sidelined. The ongoing negotiations could lead to critical decisions such as Ukraine's possible concession of territory to Russia in exchange for peace. This week's talks, occurring simultaneously in Paris and Riyadh, highlight the urgency of finding a solution. The Trump administration's willingness to engage with both Russia and Ukraine could alter the trajectory of the war. However, the lack of direct Ukraine involvement in the Saudi talks suggests a challenging road ahead, raising questions about how an agreement might be reconciled with Ukraine's territorial integrity. The stakes are undeniably high, and the coming days may reveal whether the US can broker a lasting peace or if tensions will continue to escalate. As the world watches closely, the resolution of this conflict hangs in the balance.
Providing more analysis about the most recent updates concerning the last Russo-Ukraine war, peace talks to end Russian-Ukrainian war begin in Saudi Arabia. How could U.S. mediation under Trump help end the three-year war? We're joined from Moscow by Dr. Sergei Markov, former advisor to Russian President Vladimir Putin, and from New York, Ms. Irina Zuckerman, political researcher. Good afternoon to you both, and let me start here with Dr. Markov. Now, Dr. Markov, with the US-Russia talks on Ukraine taking place in Saudi Arabia, how do you view Russia's position on a peace agreement under the mediation of the Trump administration?
First of all, it's not so much mediation about Trump administration because it's not a Russian-Ukrainian war. Ukraine, from our point of view, does not exist as an independent country. Ukraine now occupied by Western coalition, which include American deep state, administration, American government, now led by Donald Trump, in past led by Joe Biden, British administration, British deep state, European Commission, and main European countries like France and Germany and Poland. So this is dictator of Ukraine, and Ukrainians doesn't want the war, but because they're occupied by Western countries, they have to fight. So the main Russian proposals is to resolve the reason of such crisis. It's Ukrainian regime, which not democratic, but on contrary, which is repressive, neo-Nazi style, using terrorist methods both against Russia and against own citizens. So Russian solution is democracy for Ukraine as main security guarantee and main solution. Thousands of the political prisoners should be liberated from Ukrainian prisons and should allow to have political activity. Something about 20 political parties in Ukraine have been prohibited by a Ukrainian regime, including Communist Party. You may know that all neo-Nazis, first what they are doing, they're prohibiting Communist Party. We are not communists, but Communist Party should not be prohibited. And also, all political repression against Russian language should be stopped. Russian language is native language for the 70% of Ukrainian citizens. And this Ukrainian neo-colony repressive regime prohibit such language in all official spheres, including education, media, governmental institutions, and so on. This should be a main solution. Russia will call denazification, de-Russification, and demilitarization, meaning limitation of some kind of weaponry for such regime. It's the solution which Russia suggested. If Western countries agree, this if dictator and occupier of Ukraine agree, the peace deal should be reached very simple. Now we can see Donald Trump wants to stop this war and come to the peace. But Vladimir Zelensky, maniac of the war, because only war helped him to preserve his dictatorship power in Ukraine. And European leaders also against the peace. European leaders also support the war. That's why we believe that Vladimir Zelensky and European leaders should be excluded from the peace negotiation, because it's reasonably in peace negotiations should be only those who support the peace.
Mr. Zuckerman, I guess you followed Mr. Markov here and his answer. From your point of view, how does or how will the Ukrainian government view the current peace talks between the US and Russia that is being held in Saudi Arabia?
Thank you so much for your question. I did try to follow Dr. Markov's comments. It was a little bit difficult because the story with Russia's reasons for the war in Ukraine keeps changing every time, from denazification to NATO attacks to now bringing democracy. It seems to be a new phenomenon every day. Regarding Ukraine, their position is very clear. There cannot be any peace process without the country mainly affected by the war participating directly in the peace process, which makes sense. It makes just about as much sense as President Trump deciding on the fate of Gaza without participation of Gazans or other regional actors in these talks. This real estate approach to politics simply does not work. Also, what doesn't work is giving a platform, a one-sided platform, to international aggressors who have violated international law to demand concessions, sanctions, relief without any sort of accountability for their actions. That will not bring about an end to the war. It will only bring about encouragement of more aggression, and will bring about giving resources to Russia, which has staged violent attacks around the world, not just in Ukraine, to continue its campaign of expanding violence and exporting corruption. As far as Ukraine is concerned, I'm sure they will be happy to participate in any direct discussion that involves all relevant actors, and they are not calling for one-sided discussions. They are calling for comprehensive talks involving all the regional stakeholders, which should be noted. I also would like to point out that it's very interesting, the comment about no mediation in Saudi Arabia. Essentially, this is a one-sided demand to capitulate by the United States to Russia's demands, which I think is laughable because for one simple reason, the US has all the leverage in these talks. And the second, I think it's an insult to Saudi Arabia, which has been a very serious actor in mediating various deals between Russia and Ukraine previously, including prisoner exchanges, as well as other international conflicts and resolving tensions. So to say that they will have no mediation role in this discussion is an affront to the host.
I guess that Saudi Arabia will have to respond to that, but I have to say here that Saudi Arabia is facilitating such a meeting with good faith for in order to be able for this war that has disrupted the whole world for almost 3 years now. Now, Dr. Markov, if I may get back to you, and as the conflict enters its third year, now, how do you assess the military impact of Ukraine's recent counter-offensive on Russian-held territories?
I'm not sure. Ukrainian counter-offensive?
Yes.
Ukrainian...
Yes, we've seen some of the counter-offensives of Ukraine in the Russian-held territories, sometimes even in, to a certain extent inside Russia. How do you view this?
Ukrainian troops invaded some of the Russian territories in Kursk regions, in so-called internationally recognized part of Russia in Kursk regions. They took control of the few villages there, and there are intensive fighting there because Zelensky sent a lot of troops, Ukrainian troops there, and I think it has this Ukrainian invasion has only political reason for Vladimir Zelensky, but has no military sense. From Russian point of view, of course, these villages make point, but this is Russian territory. Only Russian territories Ukraine invaded, only from point of view of somebody else. But from our point of view, Donbass, Donetsk, Lugansk region, Zaporozhye, Kherson region, all of them Russian regions. And we have intensive fighting now on Russian territory. I would say this is very correct judicial approach, what I told about. But if you go to the Russian street and ask them, they will say, look, Kherson, not only Kherson, Zaporozhye, but Kharkov, Odessa, Dnipropetrovsk, and Kyiv, capital of Ukraine, they are also Russian cities. Kyiv was capital of Russia during 3 centuries in history. The language of the 90% of the people in Odessa and Kharkov is Russian language. If you have real free referendum in Odessa or in Kharkov, where they should be, where they want to be in Ukraine and Russia, 80% will say they want to be part of the Russian Federation, for sure. They are Russians.
So again, what do you think about the counteroffensive operations that were carried out by Ukraine in the Russian-held territories? How do you assess the strategic impact of that?
No strategic impact, frankly speaking. It's just, Zelensky showed me. He understands how information space is working, and so he made this invasion to the Kursk region only for the political show to improve his negotiation position in his negotiation with United States and European countries. But of course, it's a humanitarian tragedy because behavior of the Ukrainian troops very brutal and violated most of the human rights and principles. And but same time, the fact that he took some of the villages, it's has no political sense from strategic and military point of view. Russia, in the period when Zelensky took few villages in Kursk region, Russia took control of the few real big cities and the hundreds of the villages in Donbas region.
Mm-hmm. Ms. Zuckerman, how likely is it that Ukraine would consider territorial concessions to Russia in exchange for peace, from your point of view, or from the negotiations that are taking place right at this very particular stage?
I think President Zelensky has already proposed an appropriate solution to this problem, which is a territorial swap. He gives up the occupied territories in Kursk in exchange for Russia fully withdrawing from the territories it occupied in Ukraine, considering that Russia is up to sending donkeys and North Koreans into battle, while Ukraine is aimed with the newest top-of-the-line lasers of its own production. I think the answer, what is more likely here, is very clear, and the fact that Russia is now begging Trump for a bailout while losing militarily is also very telling. It's been 6 months since Ukrainians have occupied Kursk. Russia has not been able to break through that offensive. For a country that doesn't exist, according to Dr. Markov, the Ukrainians, including from Kharkiv, where I was born as a Russian speaker, have courageously fought and died resisting Russian invasion, which included massacres of civilians in Bucha and other areas. And it's fascinating that Dr. Markov describes Kiev as Russian when it is older than Moscow and was independent, while Muscovites were paying off tribute to the Mongol horde, now being idealized in Russian history books and Russian propaganda.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Markov, if I may ask you here, about what Ms. Zuckerman spoke about the concessions that will be made of territories here said by the Ukrainian president. What's your take on that, and how would Russia look into that?
Russia expressed its position. Vladimir Putin many times told that no any territorial exchange. All Ukrainian soldiers who come to the internationally recognized Russian territory, which is Kursk region, will be just killed. And no exchange of territories. It's absolutely clear.
So, from your point of view, how will you address the European leaders' concerns over those talks and definitely what do you think the role that could be played by the West in these peace negotiations?
I think West now is split. We could see Donald Trump, who expressed first of all political will of American people. American people want to make the deal with Russia for the many reasons, because they don't want to spend so big money. First, secondly, because American people don't see any perspective for Ukrainian army to win this war. Thirdly, Americans and Donald Trump believe that this crisis moved Russia close to the China, and China regarded by Americans and by Donald Trump as main strategic competitors during future decades. Also, Donald Trump and a lot of Americans could see that those who support war in Ukraine against Russia, the enemies of Donald Trump. Look, Vladimir Zelensky, he was enemy of Donald Trump all the time. He helped to the domestic American enemies like Joe Biden many times. And also European leaders, they also so-called globalists, liberal, and so on. And it's one point. Another point that, from our point of view, Donald Trump represents American people. But leaders of France, Germany, and Great Britain don't represent people in their countries. This country, as Vice President Vance, truly,
Mr. Markov, of course, this is your point of view. This is according to your point of view.
Of course,
because so far they were elected by their own people, right?
I'm saying my point of view, but it's also not point of view. It's also point of view of Vice President Vance, Vice President of the United States of America, that Europe is sharply violating democratic principles. And if you look on the popularity of the government in the Great Britain, France, and Germany, you could see the popularity of those governments are nearby the zero. So,
but they were democratically elected.
Peace on Ukraine, and European government want war in Ukraine. That's why we believe they contradict to the very simple democratic principles. Democratic leader represent the people, what the people want. Europeans want peace, and European leaders of European government want the war.
Right. Ms. Zuckerman, as both sides prepare for further negotiations, what do you think, what measures should be taken to ensure Ukrainians' territorial integrity and definitely is maintained? And let me here ask you, how do you think those negotiations will reflect on the transatlantic relations and particularly the relations between the United States and Europe?
Thank you so much for asking. To ensure Ukraine's territorial integrity, the first thing to do is to include it in negotiations. I think there is no one as responsible for its own integrity and that's as well equipped to speak on its own behalf than Ukraine. And it's not normal to exclude a country that is under attack from negotiations over its own territories. This will not lead to any lasting peace and it will not be effective. Regarding negotiations with the European allies, I think it is crucial that this should be a broad discussion. I think that for all the criticisms, legitimate and otherwise, and all the tensions and all the political differences between the United States and Europe, by far the European countries have been the closest allies of the United States on many issues, supporting NATO operations around the world, providing vital intelligence, vibrant economic exchanges, security assistance. And I think while there is certainly challenges within those countries, nobody will claim that any of those countries are perfect. It is a far cry from Russian authoritarianism, where critics are regularly assassinated, thrown in prison, and where countries are invaded in international law.
Briefly, because we're running out of time, Ms. Zuckerman. I guess that was Dr. Sergei Markov, former advisor to Russian President Vladimir Putin, and Ms. Reina Zuckerman, political researcher. We thank you both for your very special insights here. And I guess that brings us to the end of today's episode of Think Tank. Many thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more updates on Qnews.